Imagine an army so long that if you stood at its rear, you might not even see where it begins. Now imagine that this army isn't just a line of soldiers, but an entire city on the move. A city with smoking kitchens, tents being packed at dawn, medics treating wounds, engineers hauling tools, and even merchants selling bread and wine in the middle of the march. In this video, you'll step inside the moving machine that was a Roman legion on the march, hour by hour, step by step, and by the end, you may find yourself asking, could I even survive a single day walking beside the soldiers of Rome? Before we understand how a Roman march worked, we have to face the numbers, and they're staggering. During the High Empire, a typical campaign force could include 2 full legions, roughly 13,000 to 14,000 highly trained legionaries, but they weren't alone. Marching with them were 5,000 to 6,000 auxiliary troops, Numidian cavalry, Syrian archers, Germanic infantry and slingers from Hispania, soldiers who weren't Roman citizens but who fought for Rome in exchange for pay and the promise of citizenship. These auxiliaries brought diversity and specialization to the army, filling in the tactical gaps that the heavy infantry could not. Their skills in riding, skirmishing, and ranged combat were essential to the legion's flexibility on campaign. Right there we're talking about nearly 20,000 armed men. Now add those who made everything work behind the scenes, 3,000 to 4,000 cooks, slaves, servants, and military laborers. They cared for the mules, cooked meals, repaired weapons, set up tents, dug ditches, and hauled the countless pieces of equipment needed to keep the army functioning. Many were officially part of the army itself, while others belonged to senior officers or were hired locally as specialists. And speaking of equipment, it's estimated that a marching army brought along between 4,500 and 5,000 mules, plus the horses of officers, cavalrymen, and messengers. Each animal could carry up to 130 kilograms of gear, wood for construction, iron tools, tent poles, stakes for fortifications, sacks of grain, jars of vinegar and oil, spare weapons, siege tools, and even the disassembled frames of catapults and ballistae. The sound of these animals, the clatter of hooves and the creaking of leather harnesses, would have filled the morning air long before the soldiers themselves began to move. Add it all together, and you have a force of 25,000 to 30,000 living beings on the move. Men, horses, mules, oxen, carts and weapons, advancing as one living organism. And that's not counting the civilian merchants, local guides, or temporary messengers who came and went between villages and forts, selling supplies, scouting ahead, or delivering reports to commanders. The historian Polybius once described the legion's march as a moving wall of flesh. And he wasn't exaggerating. A legion in motion could stretch for 8 to 12 kilometers down the road, a living column of armor, dust, and discipline. From above, it must have looked like a massive serpent winding through valleys and plains, glinting with metal as it moved. Eugenius warned that on the Roman march, formation mattered more than bravery in battle. The head of the column could be crossing a river, while the rear was still tearing down tents from the previous night's camp. Timing and coordination were everything. Each section of the army had its place in the column, and every man knew the rhythm of the march, like the beat of a drum. That kind of scale created a serious problem. How do you move a monster like that every single day without it collapsing under its own weight? The answer lay in discipline, planning, and a system so well rehearsed that it could function like clockwork even in complete darkness. That's what we'll see, starting with the next Roman morning. The March of Rome began when the world was still asleep, between 3 and 4 in the morning, during the 4th watch of the night. The first sound that broke the silence wasn't clashing swords or barking orders, but the muffled gallop of horses. They belonged to the speculators, the legion's eyes and ears. More than mere scouts, they were an elite group trained to move ahead of the column, detect ambushes, monitor enemy movements, evaluate routes, and investigate suspicious villages. They rode silently through fog and darkness, using the stars or the faint outlines of roads to navigate. Their mission was simple but vital, to ensure that nothing interrupted the advance of the Roman serpent. Meanwhile, back at camp, centurions moved through the rows of tents, waking their men with a brief blast of the cornu, the curved brass horn used for military signals. Nothing was improvised. Each contubernium, a basic group of 8 legionaries, took down its leather tent, folded and packed it with precision, checked weapons, tightened armor straps, and inspected the condition of their sandals. Fire pits were extinguished, tools collected, and every man made sure he carried exactly what he was assigned. Most importantly, every soldier carried his own world on his back. A Roman legion had no wagons for personal gear. Each man marched with 20 to 30 kilograms of load, his armor, shield, weapons, rations, stakes for fortifications, a shovel, a cooking pot, water flask, and spare clothing. What he carried wasn't just equipment, it was self-sufficiency, the guarantee that wherever the legion went it could survive without relying on cities or supply depots. His gladius, shield, javelins, cooking tools, 3 days' worth of dry rations, stakes for fortification, and digging tools. Every Roman soldier was not only a warrior but a builder, a carrier, and a laborer in motion. Each man embodied the dual nature of the Roman army, a force that conquered through combat and survived through relentless organization. The tools he carried were symbols of that discipline, proof that victory depended as much on preparation as it did on the sword. At the same time, the High Command convened to review intelligence gathered during the night. The legatus legionis, military tribunes, and chief engineers examined reports brought by couriers and scouts, assessing everything from enemy movements to weather patterns. They discussed which valleys were flooded, which roads were blocked, and where enemy tracks had been spotted in the mud. Once all the information was analyzed, the legatus made the final decision: the day's route, the pace, and the potential halting point for the night. Marshes, rocky hills, and narrow ravines were avoided, unless absolutely necessary. The golden rule of Roman logistics was clear: the march must always flow, always advance, never stall, and never expose itself to danger. As officers finalized their plans, life stirred among the animals that formed the backbone of the army's mobility. Mules were fed with grain and watered, their loads checked by handlers, who knew exactly how much weight each beast could bear without faltering. Carts were inspected for cracks in their wheels and tightened with fresh leather straps. Every cart and animal had an assigned place within the column, and their movements were planned with the same precision as a battle line. This was the impedimenta, the supply train, the slow but vital artery of the army. Its organization demanded near military discipline because even a single mistake, a broken axle or a misplaced cart, could halt the entire column and expose it to ambush. Just before sunrise, the army began to move. The transformation from camp to march happened with astonishing order. Fires were extinguished, ashes buried, tents folded, and tools secured. As dawn broke, the head of the column was already in motion, and with it came one of the defining sounds of Rome on the move, a rhythm of sandals striking earth in perfect unison. The atmosphere was subdued, almost ritualistic. Soldiers marched in silence. There was no talking out of turn, no laughter, no singing. Discipline ruled every step. Rome's doctrine of silence on the march was strategic. It denied enemies any warning. No one outside the legion should know that Rome was coming until it was already too late to react. At the very front, where the road vanished into the unknown and danger waited behind every bend, marched the Vanguard. This was no improvised unit of scouts. It was a hand-picked force, deliberately structured for speed, flexibility, and lethal efficiency. Rome understood that an ambush on the march could destroy an entire army before it even had time to form ranks. For that reason, the vanguard was composed of elite auxiliary troops. non-Roman soldiers drawn from the empire's most formidable warrior cultures. Numidians and Thracians formed the light cavalry, expert horsemen capable of swift maneuvers across rough and unpredictable terrain. Their mounts were trained to charge up rocky slopes, ford rivers, and wheel about with almost supernatural agility. Gauls, with their hunters' instincts and natural sense for movement through forested terrain, served as skirmishers. Cretan archers and Syrian bowmen provided long-range coverage, their arrows able to disrupt ambushes before they could close the distance. Protecting the core of that forward line were the light infantry, men stripped of heavy armor, carrying only what was essential. Their purpose was to run, strike, and retreat within moments, clearing obstacles and reacting to threats long before the main body of the army arrived. They were the first to test the safety of roads, to remove barricades, and to confront whatever resistance appeared from the tree line or mountain passes. Every village, every grove, and every bend in the road was their battlefield. Their daily work was relentless. They faced tribal ambushes hidden behind tree lines, dismantled traps made from logs or sharpened stakes, checked for concealed pits covered with brush, and entered silent settlements to gauge their intentions. If resistance appeared, the vanguard didn't hesitate. It struck fast, scattered opposition, and signaled the all-clear for the main column to proceed. But the vanguard's duty wasn't just to fight. It served as the army's early warning system, its first and most fragile line of communication. In regions like Germania, where thick forests swallowed sound and visibility, the distance between the vanguard and the main body could stretch up to 3 kilometers. That space was crucial. It gave the army time to react to threats without descending into confusion. Messages and signals passed swiftly back through mounted couriers, relaying the status of roads, bridges, or potential ambushes. Ancient writers like Vegetius and Tacitus both emphasized how vital the vanguard's integrity was. Losing it often spelled disaster. Panic could ripple backward like fire through dry grass, and once order was lost in such a massive column, recovery was nearly impossible. That's why Rome entrusted this role only to proven soldiers, veterans hardened by years, sometimes decades, of continuous campaigning. These men knew how to read terrain like a book, how to distinguish the silence of peace from the silence of a lurking enemy. They had authority to make instant decisions, to halt, to divert, or to attack without waiting for orders. If they failed, the legion's heart would never even have a chance to respond. Following closely behind the vanguard marched a group that few noticed, but upon whom the entire army depended: the agrimensors, the military surveyors. Their job wasn't to fight, but to think, to measure, and to plan. Armed with tools like the groma, used for precise alignment, and the chorobates, used to level ground, these men transformed any wilderness into a structured landscape. They determined where the army would stop, where the camp would rise, and how it would be defended. Even before a single tent was pitched or a stake driven, they had already calculated the future site of the knight's Castrum, the fortified camp built at the end of each march. Every location they chose had to meet exacting criteria. It needed a clean and reliable water source, dry and stable soil, elevation for defense and visibility, and easy access to wood and stone for construction. The camp also had to be within reach of food supply routes, but far enough from swamps or forests that could conceal attackers. Choosing poorly could doom a legion. A flooded field could mire carts and animals. A hidden ridge could give enemies the high ground, or a lack of timber could leave the troops exposed. The surveyors had only hours to decide, and their measurements had to be exact. Marching near these men was the command nucleus of the army, the mind directing its every movement. The legatus legionis, the commanding general, did not travel at the very front, or lag at the rear. Instead, he positioned himself near the center of the moving formation, a deliberate choice that allowed him to issue orders equally in all directions. Surrounded by his personal guard, military tribunes, and a staff of engineers and record keepers, he maintained a constant flow of communication. Couriers, known as cursors, rode back and forth, carrying coded messages to the vanguard, flanks, and rear guard. Every command had to reach its target swiftly and silently, because hesitation or confusion could turn an orderly march into a disaster. Writers such as Frontinus, in his Stratagmata, recorded how entire campaigns were won or lost, based on choices made by commanders like the legatus. A camp placed too low could flood after one night of rain. A missed vantage point could give the enemy a perfect platform for attack. Even a river that seemed protective could become a trap if it proved too shallow to deter pursuit. Rome's leadership learned these lessons through centuries of trial, and by the height of the empire, the art of the march had become a perfected science. What is perhaps most astonishing is that none of this was extraordinary to them. It was routine, a daily ritual that blended military precision, logistical mastery, and relentless discipline into a seamless operation. Every action, from a soldier tying his sandals to an officer selecting a campsite, was governed by the same principle: order must never yield to chaos. And then came the heart of it all, the central nerve, the beating soul of the legion, the main body. Here marched the veteran legionaries, the fresh recruits, still learning the rhythm of discipline, the stake carriers, and the tool bearers. They were the living embodiment of Rome's power, men who literally carried the empire on their backs. This great mass consisted of around 13,000 legionaries, organized into 10 cohorts per legion, each divided into centuries of 80 men. Alongside them marched thousands more, servants, slaves, artisans, and handlers, roughly 4,000 additional personnel, and several thousand mules, each burdened with up to 130 kilograms of supplies. Together, they formed a column that could stretch for miles, yet moved as if guided by a single will. But what truly defined this immense formation was not its size, it was its discipline. The Roman march operated with the precision of a machine. Every sentry knew its exact place within the column, every man his position within the ranks, and every officer his moment to give or receive an order. The legion didn't move chaotically or spontaneously. It advanced with deliberate rhythm, one that had been rehearsed in countless campaigns across Europe, Africa, and Asia. It was not merely an army on the road, it was Rome itself, advancing, unbroken and unstoppable. Veteran soldiers were placed at the front to set the pace of the march. Their steady rhythm became the heartbeat of the entire column. New recruits were positioned in the middle, surrounded on all sides by experienced men who would correct mistakes, maintain spacing, and prevent disorder. Those known for laziness or indiscipline were deliberately placed at the rear, where they could be closely watched by officers and punished immediately if they faltered. The Roman march was not arranged for battle, but for movement. Instead of broad, imposing battle lines, the army formed a long, narrow column, often only 2 or 3 men wide. This made it possible to navigate winding valleys, forested paths, and steep mountain trails without breaking formation. Despite its vast size, the legion advanced like a single living organism, capable of turning, compressing, or expanding as the landscape demanded. Throughout the entire column, mounted messengers rode up and down tirelessly, delivering orders between commanders. Their presence ensured that the flow of communication never stopped. Trumpeters and cornices blew coded blasts to mark orders, halts, resumptions, alerts, or adjustments in pace. Every man in the legion understood those signals, and they responded instantly, as if guided by instinct rather than command. But none of this precision would have been possible without one defining element: the weight every soldier carried. Each legionary bore between 20 and 30 kilograms of gear on his back. His load included his lorica segmenta or chainmail armor, a large curved scutum shield, a short gladius sword, and 1 or 2 pila javelins ready for throwing. Along with his weapons came wooden stakes for building nightly fortifications, a shovel for digging, a pot for cooking, a water skin, spare tunics, sandals, dry rations of grain or hard bread, and personal tools for grinding, cutting, or mending. It was this immense burden that earned the soldiers their old nickname, the Mules of Marius, or Muli Mariani. The phrase dated back to the reforms of Gaius Marius, who had transformed the Roman army from a citizen militia into a professional force. His doctrine was simple: every man must carry his own world on his back. It was a philosophy that bred endurance and self-reliance. A Roman soldier could march, fight, build, and survive without waiting for supply wagons to reach him. The army's daily march covered between 20 and 30 kilometers, a distance calculated with almost mathematical precision. It was a pace designed, not for haste, but for sustainability. Pushing farther risked exhaustion, covering less would slow the campaign and expose the force to ambush. The centurions ensured that the rhythm was steady and unbroken, the same measured tread hour after hour. If a soldier collapsed and help could not reach him without halting the column, he was left behind. Discipline demanded it. Compassion came second to efficiency. Following behind the marching men came the element that held the army's life in its grasp: the baggage train. Known as the impedimenta, it was far more than a collection of carts and animals. It was the mobile heart of Rome's military machine. It carried the very sustenance of the legion: sacks of grain and salt, barrels of vinegar for preserving and flavoring food, construction materials, spare weapons, artillery pieces in pieces, tents, cloaks, footwear, medical kits, scrolls, and administrative records. Without it, the legion would last only days. The impedimenta stretched for kilometers, a slow, lumbering convoy of oxen, mules, and carts, built with reinforced wooden frames and double-rimmed wheels. Each load was carefully distributed so that no animal was overburdened. The handlers, a mix of enslaved workers, hired laborers, and long-serving attendants, knew their duties by heart. Some had marched with the same legion for years and were considered part of its extended body, yet this vital convoy was also its most fragile point. It could not move quickly, and it was vulnerable to attack. For that reason, the Romans always positioned it in the safest part of the formation, either in the center of the column or directly behind the main body of legionaries, where it could be shielded by the rear guard and flanking patrols. Any disruption, a broken wheel or an injured animal, could stall the entire army and create chaos. The historian Josephus described how, during Titus's campaigns in Judea, the rules governing the baggage train were nearly as strict as those of battle itself. No load could be removed without written authorization, and no cart could be abandoned under any circumstance. Even minor disorganization could lead to severe punishment, flogging, or worse, depending on the damage caused. Among the train also traveled essential specialists: medics equipped with surgical tools and bandages, cooks with portable mills and bronze kettles, blacksmiths to repair weapons and armor, scribes who maintained inventories and dispatches, and interpreters who dealt with locals or captured spies. There were even spare mules and horses ready to replace injured animals to ensure that the flow of supplies never stopped. Protecting this mobile lifeline was a task of the highest priority. In hostile territory, auxiliary cavalry and detachments of light infantry were permanently assigned to patrol its flanks and rear. They rode in small groups, scanning for enemy movements or signs of ambush. For the Roman legion, the loss of the baggage train meant more than losing supplies. it meant losing the ability to live, eat, and fight. Even the most disciplined soldiers could not maintain formation on an empty stomach. And guarding the rear of this vast procession was the final, often overlooked, line of defense, the rear guard. This was the legion's invisible shield, the barrier that ensured nothing approached from behind unnoticed. In Roman doctrine, serving in the rear was not a demotion or punishment, it was a mark of trust. These men had to remain alert, composed and fearless. The rear guard rotated regularly, composed of auxiliary archers, cavalry, and seasoned infantry who had proven their discipline under pressure. They collected stragglers who had fallen behind, guarded against ambushes from the rear, and ensured that the baggage train remained secure. They also bore the psychological burden of knowing that if the enemy struck from behind, they would be the first, and sometimes the only, line of defense. For the Romans, the danger of a rear attack was not just a physical threat but a mental one. The fear of being caught unaware, trapped between the enemy and their own column, could unravel even the strongest army. The rear guard existed to prevent that, to maintain calm, order, and the unbroken rhythm of Rome's relentless advance. A rear attack, even a small one, could unleash chaos in an instant. All it took was a single spark, a rumor spreading among the servants and auxiliaries, a cry echoing through the baggage line, or a horn call misunderstood by a nervous centurion, and within minutes, fear could ripple through the column like fire through dry grass. Tens of thousands of men, animals, and carts packed into narrow roads could turn from an orderly procession into a tangled, stampeding mass. Panic was the true enemy of Rome's marches, and the rear guard existed to extinguish it before it began. That was why the rear guard was composed of some of the most disciplined soldiers in the legion. Their vigilance was constant, and their rotation frequent. Units were swapped out regularly to prevent exhaustion and maintain sharp focus. Beyond defense, the rear guard also acted as the army's line of enforcement. It was the last barrier between order and desertion. Soldiers attempting to flee the campaign were caught at the tail of the column, and punishment was swift. During difficult campaigns, particularly in foreign lands, deserters were executed on the spot. The army could not afford to show leniency when a single man's cowardice might infect hundreds. For the Romans, discipline did not end when the march stopped or when the formation dispersed. It followed every soldier, in every action, down to his final step. The army's survival depended on it. History had already shown Rome what happened when this discipline broke down. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD remained the most haunting example. 3 entire legions under the command of Publius Quintilius Varus, around 20,000 men, were led into a deadly ambush by Germanic tribes under Arminius. Hemmed in by dense forest, heavy rain, and narrow trails, the Roman column was stretched thin, its vanguard and rear guard unable to communicate. The Germans struck from the sides and rear, cutting the army apart in waves. The terrain swallowed the legions whole. Not a single eagle standard was recovered. It was the worst defeat of the High Empire, and it scarred Roman strategy forever. The disaster taught the empire that terrain, communication, and column structure could determine life or death. From that point onward, the rear guard was strengthened and redesigned. It no longer served as a passive barrier, but as an active, intelligent shield, constantly sending scouts behind and to the sides, maintaining communication lines, and reacting instantly to signs of danger. Engineers began to accompany rear detachments to clear blocked paths, build small bridges, and ensure retreat routes were never cut off. Rome had learned through blood that flexibility was as important as courage. But while the rear guard sealed the column from behind, another equally vital group operated along its sides, the flank guards. These men didn't march in the ordered lanes of the main road. They were the shadows of the army, moving parallel through the wild, vanishing into the brush, climbing steep ridges, or appearing unexpectedly from ravines. Their presence was felt more than seen. The flanks were the army's greatest vulnerability, long, exposed stretches that could run for more than 10 kilometers on either side of the column. Protecting them demanded constant motion and sharp eyes. The flank guards were made up mostly of light, auxiliary cavalry, Numidians, Thracians, and Iberians, riders who could maneuver through uneven terrain with ease. They were supported by lightly armed infantry, men who carried minimal baggage and could react swiftly to sudden attacks. Together, they formed the legion's invisible perimeter. Their mission was simple but perilous: to observe without being observed, to detect threats before they reached the core, and to strike first if danger approached. They scouted every ridge, every cluster of trees, and every distant movement. In the dense forests of Germania or the broken hills of Dacia, they often relied on local allies, native scouts who knew the terrain intimately. These guides were invaluable, pointing out ambush zones, hidden trails, and enemy patterns that no Roman map could capture. Life for these flank patrols was harsh. They often marched twice as far as the main body, slept little, and fought skirmishes that went unrecorded in the annals of history. Their endurance had to be extraordinary. Every night, after long hours of movement, they ground wheat using small portable mills, cooking it into a thick filling porridge called pulse. When water ran low or clean sources were scarce, they mixed vinegar and salt with what they had to make posca, the sour, refreshing drink that kept Roman soldiers hydrated during the toughest days. Meanwhile, medics moved quietly through the camp, treating wounds from skirmishes or accidents during the march. Cuts were cleaned with vinegar, splints were set with wooden slats, and honey, valued for its antiseptic properties, was used as an ointment. Every injury was treated quickly, because a soldier who couldn't march was a liability. The animals, too, received attention. The mules that carried the legion's lifeline were brushed, watered, and fed with grain or hay collected along the route. Blacksmiths and engineers repaired broken axles, damaged harnesses, and worn-out gear before dawn. Any delay in maintenance meant a delay in movement, and Rome could not afford to lose time. As night deepened, the next day's orders were read aloud. The centurions gathered around the tribunes at the praetorium, where decisions were communicated directly from the legate. Instructions were clear and concise: when to rise, where to march, what terrain to expect, and what dangers to prepare for. Then came announcements of punishments, commendations, and warnings. If a soldier had failed in his duties, his sentence was carried out publicly. Executions, when required, were done methodically, without cruelty or spectacle, a grim reminder that even after sundown, discipline ruled the Roman world. Yet above all, what defined the Roman night was its silence. Once darkness fell, the camp became eerily still. The legion operated under strict sound discipline. Talking was kept to whispers. Laughter, music, and unnecessary noise were forbidden. Even the footsteps of sentries were softened by careful pacing. Fires were dimmed or shielded to avoid detection. The reason was both practical and psychological. The enemy might be listening, and silence was a weapon as powerful as any sword. Under that heavy silence, tens of thousands of men slept in ordered lines, their shields close, their weapons within reach, and their minds already preparing for another day of marching. For Rome, even the night was part of the campaign, another test of endurance, order, and absolute control. Night patrols in the Roman camp were among the most demanding duties a soldier could perform. Each century received the day's secret password, known as the tessera, a small inscribed tablet that was passed from one officer to another before darkness fell. Every guard post and sentry line required it to be presented during inspection rounds, ensuring that only authorized soldiers were on duty. Patrol shifts rotated roughly every 3 hours, divided according to the Roman system of night watches, and were deliberately staggered to keep men alert and prevent fatigue from dulling their senses. The night was divided into 4 watches, and every soldier knew precisely when his turn would come, leaving no room for confusion. The punishment for failure was terrifyingly clear. A soldier who fell asleep on watch faced the most severe sentence imaginable: execution by stoning, carried out not by strangers, but by the very men of his contubernium, his closest companions who shared the same tent and marched beside him every day. It was a brutal reminder that vigilance was not just a personal duty, but a collective responsibility. One man's negligence could doom an entire legion. These punishments, though merciless, carved an unbreakable sense of accountability into the Roman psyche. No one dared risk the dishonor of endangering his brothers or the wrath of his superiors. Even when permitted to rest, a Roman soldier never truly relaxed. He slept in full readiness, his gladius sword laid within arm's reach, his scutum shield propped beside his bedding, and his sandals neatly placed for instant use. Every man knew his assigned position in the event of an alarm, which gate to defend, which section of the rampart to reinforce, which cohort to rejoin if the camp was attacked in the night. It was a discipline so ingrained that reactions became instinctive. If an enemy dared strike in darkness, the Roman camp could transform from silence to battle readiness in moments, torches flaring, ranks forming, orders shouted in perfect sequence. The legion was never caught unprepared. It thrived on anticipation, striking first, reacting faster, and maintaining an iron grip over chaos. To an outsider, it might have seemed impossible that tens of thousands of men could operate with such precision after long days of marching and construction, yet this was the Roman way: mastery through repetition, order through obedience. After 24 hours of observing the legion's rhythm, what appeared at first glance to be a simple march revealed itself to be something much greater: a seamless performance of endurance, strategy, and dominance. Every movement had purpose, every order was calculated. The army didn't just traverse land, it conquered it with every step. Time itself seemed to bend around their discipline, as though the Romans had found a way to control not only the battlefield but the very structure of their day. The Roman legion was far more than an assembly of armed men. It was a manifestation of planning, discipline, and relentless organization. Its doctrine turned wilderness into order, chaos into geometry. No landscape was too foreign, no terrain too wild. Every inch could be measured, mapped, and converted into Roman ground. It was a machine of flesh and willpower, a living organism composed of thousands of disciplined parts working in perfect harmony. It marched like an engineered mechanism, breathed like a living creature, and each evening, when the tents rose and the walls of the Castrum took shape, it became a city, a fortress that existed only for a night before vanishing with the dawn. And now that you've walked beside it for a single day, imagine enduring this rhythm for weeks or months on end. Ask yourself, could you truly survive the endless grind, the silence, the burden, and the unyielding order of Rome's march? If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. And as always, may Mars guide you in battle.